We reckon that we can confirm 122,000 Ukrainian dead through various open sources, newspapers, obituaries, people on the ground counting. However, we've also managed to discover that there are at least 35,000 missing in action, presumed dead. So if you add those two sums together, you come up with roughly 157,000 dead. And that's about right. If you add to that another 300 plus thousand casualties, you have a good picture of what effectively has been the total destruction of the Ukrainian army that they began the war with, and an attempt to build back with reserves and untrained recruits. Now, on the Russian side, we can account for somewhere between 16 and 20,000 dead, and perhaps 50,000 wounded. When you run the calculus, that's about one Ukrainian killed for every one Russian killed. That's a losing proposition in a war. Excuse me, one Russian killed for every 8 Ukrainians killed.
Right.
And that is a losing proposition.
8 times as many Ukrainian soldiers dead as Russian soldiers dead.
Yes.
Not disputed, factually acquired from open sources. Fair to say?
Yes, absolutely. Now, bear in mind, the Ukrainians have never told the truth about their deteriorating situation. So you're not going to get the Ukrainian government under any circumstances to admit to that. On the other hand, they'll lie to you prolifically about all the Russian troops that they theoretically killed or wounded. But these figures are pretty good. They're from people on the ground, people in international organizations, people looking at the situation on the ground through satellites, a combination of all those sources, reading papers, reading reports, and so forth. And I think it's a good snapshot of where we are right now. Everyone goes back to the beginning in February of this year, when Russia went in with a very different set of assumptions that led to, in my judgment, a mistake. They went in thinking that they were going to reach some sort of negotiated settlement. They wanted to use a small force, minimize damage. What happened is that people walked away from that experience saying, well, the Russians are obviously incompetent. They're weak. They don't know what they're doing. This is not true, but that's what we thought. And as you know, historically, Washington always emotes. It doesn't think. And Washington was so enamored of the idea that the Russians were weak and incompetently led that they decided to pile on. And they've been piling on ever since. Ultimately, the outcome, though, for Ukraine is that Ukraine has long ago breached the limits of its capabilities. Russia is only now peaking. And the consequence is that they're staring annihilation in the face.
What will be the response or significance militarily, if any, of the introduction of a handful of German and French tanks into the Ukraine military? When General Zaluzhny was interviewed by The Economist, you remember this because you commented on it.
Yeah.
And he said, I need 500 tanks. You said, well, what he needs and wants is another army.
Yeah, precisely. And he can't get that. It's one thing to get new equipment. It's another to get several different types of equipment. And it's another to find people who are adequately trained and familiar with the equipment to use and employ it effectively. That's the big problem. They've released, my last look at the numbers was about 40 to 50 Bradleys were released from our pre-position sets in Europe.
Or what is a Bradley, Colonel?
It's an infantry fighting vehicle. Its main armament consists of a 25 millimeter automatic cannon on top with a 7.62 machine gun, coaxially mounted, plus a tow missile launcher. And it can normally carry 3-man crew, and you could push as many as 6 to 7, even 8 people in the back if you want to. But it's really designed for 6 in the back and 3 on board as the crew.
Can it be characterized as a tank?
No, it's not. It's just an infantry fighting vehicle. It's designed to move infantry to the battlefield and give them fire support. It's a good system. It's not revolutionary, but it's a good system. It has flaws like every armored fighting vehicle system has. But the point is, this is a brand new set of equipment for which the Ukrainians have no infrastructure logistically to support. And it's a system they don't know. And quite frankly, it's complex. It takes a long time to learn how to maintain a 20 millimeter or 25 millimeter automatic cannon with perhaps 1,000 moving parts. This is not something you just hand to somebody and say, go for it. And the same thing's true with the TOW missile. So even though these are arriving now, their ability to have much impact is limited. And hopefully, if they do use these for maximum effect, they will keep them together. The worst thing you can do is parcel these things out across the front where they won't have expertise or logistical support of any kind.
Do we know what type of hardware is about to be sent by Germany and France? Are they actually tanks? And is it more than just a handful? Or stated differently, will it have any impact on whatever France and Germany are about to send? Will it have any impact on the battlefield?
Well, the AMX-30 is a 105 millimeter rifled cannon, is essentially a British cannon that was mounted on a French wheeled chassis. It's a light armored weapon that has minimal utility. It was designed for use by the French, frankly, in North Africa, something they could rapidly fly into Chad or Algeria or wherever they were required in order to suppress insurgencies or, let us simply say, low-tech enemies. So, no, I wouldn't expect that to have much impact. The best you could do with something like that is use it in ambush inside an urban center where it has some protection. As for the German tanks, they're talking about Leopards. The Germans have provided the Gepard, which is a anti-aircraft gun, and they have had to make more ammunition for it. It's had some success. But as far as tanks are concerned, if they send the Leopard over there, it will be a landmark moment in German history, because the Germans historically have been reluctant to supply belligerents in battle with equipment for reasons that have to do with the interpretation of their constitution.
I wonder why the new chancellor, other than maybe the ideological view that it's NATO's goal to get rid of Putin, is willing to make this historic leap. If you look at the other side of the world, the Japanese are almost making a similar leap with respect to doubling the size of their military budget. And another story for another time. But what is the German chancellor's goal or game here? This can't be popular with the German people, is it?
Well, remember that all the Western publics, along with our own, have been treated to this steady diet of hatred for Russia. I mean, the mainstream media depicts Russia in every conceivable way as unfavorably as it can. Same thing is true in Germany. Lies about what the Russians have or have not done on the battlefield, about their targeting, war fighting, all of that has combined to effectively build some level of support for opposing Russia. And remember, these are old stereotypes that go back to the Second War and the Cold War. So it's easy to dig those up, refresh people's memories. But I think Scholz has lost sight of the fact that he is preeminently the Chancellor of Germany. He is not just, quote unquote, a vassal state of NATO, and that he leads a great power. I think he should seriously reconsider the wisdom of sending anything to Ukraine right now. Not only will it bring up bad memories of the Second World War to see German iron crosses painted on the sides of vehicles going into battle against contemporary Russian forces, but it just doesn't make any sense because the Ukrainians have no chance of winning. None of this stuff is going to make any difference to the outcome.
Does the resignation yesterday of the defense minister of Germany have any connection with the chancellor's wish to ratchet up German involvement in the Russia-Ukraine conflagration?
You know, I can't comment directly on that. I doubt it. I just don't know what the background is. But the sad part is that the chancellor's office has indicated that they're looking for another woman to be the defense minister. And this sort of thing is so discouraging when you would think, let's find someone who's competent to do the job to the best degree possible. But apparently that's not too important to the Germans. So I think they're very confused right now. Then, of course, you have the British. They want to send 12 or 14 Challenger 2 tanks. Remember, all of these tanks do not use the same ammunition. It's not only repair parts and engines and everything else. Supplying and sustaining this is a mess. There are probably another 100 Soviet era tanks from other places potentially available over the next few months. But again, none of this is going to change the outcome. This is tinkering on the margins of a disaster.
The Financial Times, an international newspaper written in Europe, printed all over the United States, I'm sure you're familiar with it, makes the following argument this morning in two editorials. One says, is Putin prepared for taking back Ukraine and the 20 years of guerrilla warfare which will be waged against his civilian and security forces that are there? And two, won't a Putin victory make Russia poorer, more isolated, and more dictatorial? You want to address either of those challenges?
Sure. Can I start with the second one first?
Please.
And nothing that Russia has done to this point in time has harmed Russia. Russia's position in the world has grown much stronger. Their oil and gas exports are way up. The ruble is stronger. Their economy is stronger. So the notion that somehow or another Russia's decision to intervene in Ukraine to protect itself and eliminate the possibility that Ukraine could become a member of NATO has harmed it, I think is just fundamentally false. And I don't see any evidence at all that that will change in the near future. Now, the first question is important. Can you repeat that?
Is President Putin prepared after his likely Russian victory to tolerate 20 years of guerrilla warfare against whoever or whatever is going to run the government in the parts of present-day Ukraine that will be returned to Russia, whether it's Russia-friendly Ukrainian politicians or Moscow stand-ins?
Well, the first point, I think, is to keep in mind that mentioning this insurgent warfare that we are theoretically prepared to support for 20 years is probably a guarantee that Russian forces will have to march all the way to the Polish border and to the Romanian border and the Moldovan border.
So that there are no super patriots remaining who want to shoot at Russian security forces from the tops of office buildings.
Yes. I mean, you have to put yourself in the position of the Russian state. If you knew that if you did not do what I just described and completely take Ukraine at this point, you ran the risk of being the victim of such an insurgency and guerrilla tactics. However, on the other hand, I don't think that's something that the Russians ever wanted to do. I mean, Putin is on record several times in the last 10 years of saying that in his judgment, the people of Western Ukraine would be happier under Polish administration than Russian administration on any given day. He knows that he's not going to win friends and cultivate goodwill in Western Ukraine no matter what he does. So I think he would prefer to avoid that. His concern is exactly what you expressed. If I sign an agreement that says consigns everything east of the Dnieper River, east of Kiev, including potentially Odessa, I don't know, but I would suspect so, back to Russian control, will that then be the end of it? That's the question he has to ask. And if we don't sign on for this and we don't supply guarantees of security, then I guess he says I can't sign, and he marches all the way to the west. This is the dilemma that we have failed to understand. We have made this much worse than it could have ever been, and it continues to get worse. It's not just piling on all of this extra equipment that's not going to change the military outcome. It's sort of pouring salt in the wound. We made it clear, it's not just regime change, it's humiliate Russia, destroy it, dismember it. Insane. Under those circumstances, I'm surprised that we'll get through this without a nuclear exchange.
Colonel, do you fear that the United States of America may precipitate a nuclear exchange rather than suffer the loss of this proxy war, which at the present moment seems inevitable?
Well, Judge, you know, that's always been my nightmare. I'm not concerned about a bolt out of the blue attack by the Russians. I've always been concerned that we would then, under the circumstances we've described, when the Ukrainian military capability simply collapses and the state is in ruins and its government is ineffective and unavailable to rule, that we would then try to intervene some way or another. And this intervention then would precipitate a collision with the Russians that we would lose. And when I say lose, again, it's back to simple mathematics and an understanding of who holds the high ground. We're fighting on Russia's doorstep. If the Russian army sent 100,000 troops to the Mexican border, we would crush them simply because they're on our border, and we could put 1 million men on the border and ultimately crush them. So we would lose. Then the question is, do we accept ignominious defeat and withdrawal or not. And again, this goes back to the other issue we've discussed, which is NATO. We keep hearing this: if NATO doesn't win, if we don't win, NATO's in trouble. So we essentially turn this into an existential question for us when it never was. It's existential for Russia. What happens in Ukraine is an existential matter, but not for us. Yet we've made it that. And so there's a real probability that if the Russians move in, and I think they will sooner than later, and crush the Ukrainians, that NATO will be in trouble. The alliance is going to stand around, and many members are going to say, well, why am I in this? If the United States is not going to commit itself to an all-out war, why should we be members?
Do we know of any back channel negotiations going on, or has Biden refused to sort of Bigfoot Zelensky, and Zelensky is refusing to talk to the Russians?
Again, I think that if President Biden and his handlers decided to end things, they could pick up the phone and do it immediately, and Zelensky would obey. So I don't buy the notion that Zelensky is an independent actor. Look, we've spent $50 billion in cash, equipment, and support thus far. This is of all the, you talk about over $100 billion, but that much we have spent. We own the Ukrainian state. It's the 51st state. We pay for its government. They're not independent. So we can stop this anytime we want. The problem is there's no evidence that anybody wants to. Now, have any of the Europeans stepped forward and tried to open channels to Moscow? You know, I know that the French have made murmurings in that direction. The Germans have obviously failed miserably, and they were always the best position to do it. But if we persist in this and Ukraine is utterly destroyed, I suspect that the Europeans will have to take things in hand. And again, that spells, in my judgment, the end of NATO.
The Pentagon announced that it will be training Ukrainian technical crews in Oklahoma on the use, operation, and maintenance of the Patriot missile system. How impractical and how slow is this going to prove to be?
Well, normally it takes 3 months of formal schooling for American soldiers to effectively master all the tasks that are expected of them to work on this very complex anti-missile system or anti-aircraft system. So I would think that for the Ukrainians, it might take a little bit longer simply because of the language barrier. But the point is, the way things are developing right now, I'd be surprised if they had much of a Ukraine to deploy to in 3 to 4 months.
You know, I don't even know if it's lawful for the American government to train foreign troops at American expense on American military property. Do you have any, in your long career in the military, do you have any familiarity or experience with this, Colonel?
A little bit. Obviously, with regard to Latin America, we've done this for decades. We actually established formal schools for it. The so-called Schools of America used to be characterized in the most hostile terms by our opponents as having schooled most of the terrorists and so forth that they dislike. So no, this is nothing new. We've done this before. The CIA has done it for forever. My point is, I just don't think this is going to make much difference to the outcome on the ground in Ukraine. It simply won't. It's not going to happen fast enough. And then, of course, you've got to push everything over there, all the equipment. Then you have to provide lots of missiles. Remember, you shoot 2 missiles at every target. You could go through 1,000 missiles in Ukraine in a few days.
So the Patriots that the Biden administration is sending are not there. And when they do, I assume they're in Germany. I mean, they're not in the U.S., but it's going to take 3 months before the Ukrainians are prepared to use them. Where's the war going to be in 3 months? In 3 months, winter will be a little bit behind us.
Well, I think this is really the most important question today, because of all the information that's pouring into us right now. There's a great deal of information that the entire Ukrainian front facing the Russians in southern Ukraine is now severely weakened and in many parts simply crumbling. On average, the brigades that have been fighting the Russians in and around Bakhmut and surrounding towns, right now their casualties have reduced them to about 30% of their normal strength.
So 30% of the Ukraine normal strength.
Ukrainian 4,000 man brigade.
Wow.
So if you're talking about 4,000 men, that means that you've lost 2,800. We're talking in the space of the last few months, 15, 20 brigades have rotated in and out. They've now had to disband some of these brigades and consolidate them with others. I mean, frankly speaking, it's not the perfect analogy, but I would compare it to the Army of Northern Virginia in the spring of 1865. They've simply been bled white. And they're now building what they hope will be effective defenses in a town called Kramatorsk, a line that is much further north and west from where they are currently. They may be able to retreat to it, but I think once the offensives begin, Ukrainians are going to find that their backs are up against rolling open terrain, which is the perfect killing ground for the Russians against the Ukrainians. So I think we're really coming into the end phase of certainly the war in eastern Ukraine.
All right. So I know this is your field of specialty, which is tank warfare. The Ukrainians are still begging for tanks. The chancellor of Germany has indicated he's willing to send German tanks to Ukraine. I don't know how easy it is for the Ukraine troops to operate German tanks, or if tanks are interchangeable, if the Germans are unique and requires a lot of training. However, he says he doesn't want to do that if German tanks are the only tanks in Ukraine. Hint, hint, he wants American tanks there. So a couple of questions. How practical or impractical is this for Ukraine troops to use German tanks? Is this the right time of year for tanks in Ukraine? And how crazy is the idea that the Americans would send tanks?
Well, you know, my view is that we should have stopped this a long time ago. So obviously, right. I don't support the idea, but ideally, you want one type of tank. You don't want to have to deal with 4 or 5 different kinds of tanks, because truthfully, the sighting mechanisms, the firing mechanisms, the training that's required for each one is different. So I do understand the desire to stick with one. The Leopard tanks are more exacting in their demands on the crew than on an M1 tank. M1.
Right, so Leopard is American or German?
No, the Leopard series tanks are German. And having been on both of them, they're both excellent tanks. Let there be no mistake about it. Of the two, I would choose the Leopard simply because it has a good diesel engine on it. You don't have to refuel it every 6 to 8 hours. So from that standpoint, I would do so. I would opt for the German thing. But I understand the German position. I think the Germans are worried, and justifiably, I would add, that they're going to be hung out to dry. And their equipment will not only be destroyed, but in many cases captured. I think that's also a concern on the U.S. side. I think we know that the Ukrainian armed forces are crumbling.
Is this a mechanism for introducing German troops and American troops on the ground? Well, the equipment's there and you guys can operate it better than we can, and you don't need the lead time for training to use it because you already know how to use it. Is that what's coming?
Well, on the German side, I can tell you that if they were trying to secretly or surreptitiously introduce their equipment that could be manned by Germans into the theater, the German government would be thrown out of office within 24 hours. There's no support in Germany to send German troops, certainly not to Russia, certainly not to fight Russians. On our side, I don't know. I suppose that's a possibility, but I've seen so little evidence for a coherent strategy, so little evidence for serious pre-planning and preparation that it's hard for me to believe anybody's thinking that far in advance.
Earlier this morning, you sent me an email that you had received from an Australian colleague and observer of what he saw on the Ukrainian front. Here's what he said to you. According to an Australian source near the Bakhmut area, in daily contact with the frontline Ukrainian soldiers, in my opinion, that talks about a Ukrainian offensives are nonsense. They deluded dreams of the Kyiv cabal to continue their push for more money, weapons, and support. The mood on the ground here is not good. Soldiers are severely under-equipped. Morale, from what I can see, is very low, and there is resignation among the ones that I talk to that they will fight on bravely, but that outcome is not in question. Interesting, Colonel, the outcome not in question. They know that they are facing a well-equipped, disciplined, and strengthening, another interesting word, strengthening Russian army. Confidence in the government or their leadership, that's the Ukrainian government, seems low, and there is rising anger amongst them. The same is true of ordinary people. Many are now speaking up. Many are openly critical of the Zelensky administration. They're openly angered at the West and feel betrayed. This will not end well. Okay, let's unpack this and let's start with the statement that was highlighted at the end. Are the Ukrainian people getting sick and tired of this, and do they no longer support the government's military resistance of Russia?
I think there's a great deal of evidence that people are frustrated, angry, exhausted. There's no question about that. We see a lot of evidence for the Ukrainian secret police, the SBU, gearing up operations, for instance, in Kherson, which was recently seized, and down in Odessa, where they are arresting people and in some cases, I'm told, torturing or even executing them for ostensibly pro-Russian sentiment or expressions of defeatism. This sort of thing, I think, is an indicator that, yes, there is growing discontent. On the other hand, I do admire the Ukrainian soldiers who are prepared to fight on, even though they recognize that they have no chance of winning.
What is the nature of conscription now in Ukraine? Have they lowered the age? Are they still going door to door looking for males, young males?
Well, my understanding is yes, that they're going to press into service anybody they can find who looks capable of carrying a weapon. And the problem, once again, is even though you're picking up hundreds of these people each day, putting them in uniform, handing them weapons, giving them modest training, if any, they just don't have the non-commissioned officers and the officers with experience to lead them anywhere. And so most of these people are literally lambs being led to the slaughter.
You have talked at length about the significance of the call up of previously active duty, but then on sort of National Guard civilian life, Russian soldiers coming back to active duty. And you've opined that that number is about 300,000. They've been in training since September. Here it is, January. Are they ready? Are they there? Have they entered the theater of war? Does General Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian military, know they're coming?
I think Zaluzhny, actually does know, and he made that very clear in his interview with The Economist, where he said their mobilization, quote unquote, has been effective. The numbers are indisputable. They are well trained. They are well equipped. He's made that very clear. I think that, frankly, the Russian forces are ready, but keep something in mind. Any commander you ask on the eve of war is always going to tell you, well, I wish I had more time. I mean, in 1991, the unit I was with, the 2nd Cavalry, we were extremely well trained. And as we discovered, probably overtrained for the task that we were assigned, but we had no way of knowing. So your predisposition is always to say, well, if you can give us a little more time, I think we'll be that much better. I'm sure that some of the Russian commanders have a similar attitude, but the truth is, I think they're more than ready for what needs to be done. There's very little facing them up north. And that has to be understood. There are very few brigades, 3 light brigades, and if they're at full strength, that's 12,000 men. And you're talking about an offensive that will consist of 80 to 100,000 men just in the combat force. That is the people that are going to roll in to Western Ukraine. So, no, I think they're ready to go. Plus, remember, there were also 80,000 Russian volunteers in addition to the 300,000 reservists. These are people that want to fight.
Oh boy, you would never hear this in the mainstream media. 80,000 Russian volunteers?
Yes.
Why isn't that on the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post or even my buddies at Fox?
Well, I think we know that contradicts the narrative that everyone in Russia is angry and wants to rid itself of Putin when the opposite is obviously the case.
How complex is this whole mess of the atmosphere and attitude of Nazism amongst the Ukrainians, their well-known reputation for financial and political corruption, the unwillingness of the United States to account for where the dollars go, the involvement of Ukrainian Americans and American banks in what's going on over there. Give us a handle on this. Maybe this is a little bit more diplomacy, skullduggery, intelligence than it is cavalry, but you have a better handle on this than anybody I know.
Well, first of all, let's keep in mind that the corruption has its roots in the collapse of the Soviet state. That doesn't mean that the Soviet Union was devoid of corruption. Absolutely not. Corruption has always been a fact of life in the Soviet world, much as corruption is a fact of life in much of the Latin American world. But the degree of corruption now is beyond anything that existed previously. And that's because everything broke down in Ukraine. And Ukraine also possessed factories that produced everything from tanks to missiles and aircraft. There were things in Ukraine that the oligarchs wanted, the people that took advantage of the destruction of any kind of social or political order. Into this, we step with the goal of building a powerful force designed for one purpose, which is to attack Russia and harm it, if not dismantle it. Remember that the force, when Putin sent his interventionist forces in, and initially only used 80,000 men, he was facing a Ukrainian force of over 400,000 that had been heavily trained and equipped to attack and ultimately retake Crimea. So you combine the corruption with this development, and the corruption actually makes things worse. And we had this experience over many years in the United States, where we will go in and we will create deformed economic conditions. In other words, we'll create new economies that never existed, are entirely dependent upon the largesse of American aid and assistance. That's happened in Afghanistan. We did that in Bosnia and in Kosovo. We did it in Vietnam. In other words, our very presence just breeds more corruption than would otherwise have been there.
When George W. Bush sent American dollars to Iraq, it was literally a truckload of cash.
Right.
How does the Biden administration get money to Ukraine? Do they just deposit it in a JP Morgan Chase account in New York, and it shows up in an account, in a JP Morgan Chase account in Ukraine? They're not literally, like Bush's people were doing, flying dollar bills across the Atlantic, are they?
I don't think we have to do that, because we have a semblance of a more developed financial system. And to answer your question, all you have to look at these photographs of President Zelensky sitting with Larry Fink, who is the chief executive officer for BlackRock,
Right,
along with our friend Bankman Fried from so-called FTX, who was also at the table. I think if you look at these things carefully and you understand who controls the financial system in the United States that is in league with the Congress, it's not very difficult to transfer funds. Again, how many billions went there? Where have they all gone? Nobody really knows. I mean, we can't even audit the Department of Defense. I mean, stop and consider that. How could we possibly audit Ukraine or anything in it that is hopelessly corrupt and considerably more backward in the way it does business than we do it? It's anybody's guess, but I suspect that whatever we've sent there, at least 40 to 50% has been siphoned off, probably ended up in banks in Cyprus, or other countries where we know oligarchs maintain accounts.
Let me go back to the quotation that I read, which you sent me earlier today, the observations from the Australian journalist at the front, and that is the demoralization of the troops. When he was saying it's an atmosphere of resignation. They still love Ukraine. They still want to fight for it, but they're becoming to accept the realization that they're fighting, though valiant, brave, and historic, is futile. Agreed?
Yes. And we've had these reports over the last 2 or 3 months. They've simply become more voluminous now than they were before. And it's difficult for us. We live in the world, I would say, of Walter Mitty. Everyone in D.C. is some version of Walter Mitty. They live in a make-believe world, thousands of miles remote from reality. They're dictating the narrative. They're telling Zelensky and his friends the roles that they're supposed to play. None of it is connected to reality. I don't think any of it really was to begin with. I mean, anybody who thought that this would be a quote-unquote walk in the park, I think we've heard that before, was crazy. But I think what they did is they miscalculated because, again, Mr. Putin went in there with the understanding that they was going to try and do minimal damage and compel some sort of negotiated settlement. He was dead wrong. He had no idea the depth of hatred and hostility Washington felt for him and Russia. Now he knows it. Now the so-called sledgehammer is beginning to fall in selected locations. And the thing to keep in mind is that, again, the forces fighting the Ukrainians, in it, not just Wagner, which is quite frankly looks a lot like the French Foreign Legion, which, by the way, are mercenaries and they're also excellent soldiers, but also the Chechens and other forces that are down there. These are not the frontline forces. Now, we do know that the Russians have rotated companies and battalions forward to give them an appreciation for what it's like to be under fire so that they can see their enemy. That's a very healthy thing to do. We also know that they've sent their best commanders with the most combat experience up north to Belarusia. So those men will be commanding the advanced guards of these attacks that are coming in the future. So all in all, again, to go back to your original question, I think these reports are accurate. I think to some extent, it's also reminiscent of the tragic position of the Tsar's army in World War I. Eventually, they just discovered that they could not prevail against the superior technology and capabilities of the German army. And so they finally threw in the towel and started to go home. If I were Mr. Zelensky, I'd be very worried, first and foremost, about my troops coming back to deal with me long before the Russians get there.